Hi, everyone. Welcome to the MIT SSP Wednesday seminar. I'm Taylor Fravel, director of the MIT Security Studies program. I'm really delighted today to welcome Luwei Ying to MIT. She's going to talk about military power and ideological appeals of religious extremists. So it includes all our main buzzwords: military power, extremists. It's going to be a terrific talk. She's an assistant professor of political science at the University of California in Los Angeles. She received her PhD from the Department of Political Science at Washington State University in St. Louis in 2022. And she originally comes from China, where she was a BA in international politics and a BA in journalism and communication from Tsinghua University, sometimes known as the MIT of China, or maybe MIT is the Tsinghua of the United States. So she studies international relations, focusing on civil conflict and political violence, as well as quantitative methodology. Her research examines how militant organizations propagate ideologies to mobilize, recruit, and exercise control over individual members, and how these ideological strategies fit into the group's broader military agendas. She's won a number of awards, including the 2022 Peace Science Society Walter Izard Award for the best dissertation in peace science over a 2-year period. And she's won the Best Paper in International Relations Award, the Pi Sigma Alpha Award for the Best Paper at the 2019 MPSA conference, and the Best Poster Award from Palmeth. Oh, now I've got to do Roman numerals. 37th summer meeting. So delighted to have you here today. We really look forward to hearing about your research. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. And thanks, everybody. It's a truly an honor for me to be here today. So today I want to talk about a key player in international security, religious extremists. They have shaped several core high-profile conflicts around the world. And to start, I want to tell you a story about a Syrian boy whose name is Kenan. Like most Muslims around the world, Kenan is very kind-hearted and he enjoys helping others. And like many boys of his age, Kenan likes sports. And one day, Kenan walked to school with the t-shirt of his favorite soccer team, Bazaar. But his classmates immediately call him an infidel because they say Kenan has a Christian cross on his shirt. So they burn his t-shirt, they beat him, and they even threaten his family and calling his faithful family un-Islamic. It took Kenan a while to realize that his classmates have been brainwashed by Daesh, a violent religious extremist group that to many of us known as ISIS. Kenan had a long fight with ISIS and eventually fled the country. Now Kenan is a student of me at UCLA. The reason Kenan worked with me is because he wanted to understand how do military groups like ISIS use religion in their propaganda, and how does this ideological appeal fit into their broader military agenda. Please note that I have the quotation mark around the word religion just to remind you that these groups understand religion very differently than the vast majority of Muslims around the world. And today I'm going to provide an answer to this question. Is one of my serious paper on terrorist propaganda. I call this theory the new weapon of the weak. In one sentence, when religious extremists are militarily weaker, they strategically propagate more religious rhetoric as an ideological weapon. In other words, they use religion as a tool to secure their base when they don't have other options. By the way, the name of my theory follows Martha Crenshaw, and she first established that terrorism is a weapon of the weak. And here I'm just saying that religion or ideological intensity is a new weapon of the weak. From here, I'm going to first give you some background information about the radical religious extremists I'm going to talk about today, or you can call them jihadist groups. They are the most prominent religious extremist groups around the world. And a lot of the groups you can name actually belong to this category, including ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, and the Taliban, especially after they took over Afghanistan. And then I'm going to present my weapon of the weak theory in detail. empirically, I'm going to present two analyses, one setting up the relationship between military power and ideological appeals, the other tapping into the mechanism. Here, I'm going to bring in big data, machine learning, and my original databases. And finally, I'm going to conclude with contributions and my broader research agenda. So let's talk about jihadist movements. The word jihad in Arabic is a positive term meaning to strive. It means a struggle to purify one's heart. But this term has been distorted by violent religious extremists. They call themselves jihadists. And they say jihad means to fight for Islam using violence, which is a completely incorrect interpretation of the Quran. For example, I repetitively see these groups quoting this verse from the Quran, Surah 4, Ayah 89. And if you take a closer look, they talk about the disbelievers, and then it says, but if they turn away, then seize them and kill them whenever you find them. Okay, I know what you're thinking here. This verse might appear as a call for violence against disbelievers. But if you have actually read the Quran, you'll see that in the verse immediately before this, they are talking about a very specific time of war. It was a war between Muslims in Medina and the polytheists in Mecca. And the polytheists had repeatedly betrayed Muslims and even attacked Muslims in the first place. And in the verse right after this, the Quran explicitly said, so if they refrain from fighting you and offer you peace, then Allah does not permit you to harm them. So that is Quran. But jihadists will never show you languages like this. They will only cherry pick verses like this. They don't want to really understand the religion, but instead they want to use religion as a tool to achieve their political goals. They want to use religion to control people. They want to use religion to repress people. So according to the jihadist, women need to wear a burqa the whole time in public, covering themselves from head to toe. And if anybody commit very minor like crimes like theft, their hands will be cut off. You heard that right. Jihadi groups are very obsessed with inhumane punishment like amputation. And they're just very obsessed with violence in general. So for that reason, they have become the driving forces of the fourth wave of terrorism or the current wave of terrorism. In fact, largely because of them, this wave is known as the religious wave. Especially after 2001, they are more violent and more lethal than almost any other type of groups in the world. And the majority of their victims are Muslims. So given this, let's talk about ideology. Let's talk about ideology in jihadi movements. If you have ever read research papers with a variable called ideology, then you'll probably find that that's a categorical variable. Actually, Rich has a recent article on this, also pointed that out. So, but in reality, these scholars would just assign this label to all jihadi groups, radical Islamism. That's pretty accurate, but it's just a label. In reality, an ideology is always a spectrum. And in this context, the most important spectrum is religious versus secular. This is actually rooted from the societies of the Middle East, North Africa, and some part of Asia. In these societies, the political debates always revolve from the balance between religiosity and secularism. So it also applies to jihadi organizations. This is the most important ideological spectrum of these organizations. So now the question is, where on this spectrum would a group pitch itself? Existing scholars have largely pointed out that groups advertise ideology is largely their strategic choices. And Barbara Water, in particular, has theorized that there are several advantages for these groups to choose their very extreme religious ideology. However, they're still treating ideology as a label. That's still just a label. The theoretical gap here is what explains the variation in ideological positions. Why would different jihadi groups pitch themselves differently? And why would one jihadi group pitch itself differently across time? In this paper, I argue that groups' strategic choices of ideological appeals are largely contingent on their battlefield fortunes or their military power. And I call this theory the new weapon of the weak because I argue weaker groups make more religious appeals. They use their religious ideology as an ideological weapon, and conversely, they shift to more secular rhetoric when they become stronger. Why is that the case? Because when groups are relatively weaker, their priority is to survive and to secure the core supporters. And these core and relatively fanatical supporters prefer spiritual rewards. So correspondingly, the group will try to cater to their preference. The group would talk about things like rewards in the afterlife. So these spiritual services would compensate for material scarcity. And in other words, the groups can, quote unquote, buy members with a lower material price. Also, stringent religious requirements also help the groups better screen members. So as long as the group can set the religious bar really, really high, then only the core members can meet these religious requirements, and that would just naturally screen out the free riders. There's a well-established literature on rebel screening, and here I build on this literature and further point out that groups' advertised ideology help with the screening process. And now some of you might wonder here, why would a group ever want to only talk to some of the the core members? Why don't they just try to talk to more people? At least try. Why don't they try to expand themselves? Well, in fact, group expansion is just not feasible when the group is militarily weak. They couldn't afford free riding. It's very costly, especially costly for clandestine groups like the jihadists. And they couldn't afford the high transition costs. They need to keep it low to better coordinate and to operate. And finally, even if the groups just say, I am a government for all of you, it won't sound credible for the general public. So for these reasons, militarily weaker groups will choose to make more religious appeals to secure the core supporters. So the core, the size of the supporters, is the key in this logic chain, and I highlighted it in red. Well, on the other hand, stronger groups would make more secular appeals to reach a broader audience. Why? First, because they can. They can credibly promise material benefits. They can just directly tell everybody, I'm not just talking about a utopian idea. I'm going to build an actual economy, and you will be better off under my governance. Unlike their weaker counterparts, stronger groups can afford some free riding. Stronger groups can afford transition costs. And of course, not only do they can, but they also want. They want more people. They want legitimacy. They want legitimacy domestically. A lot of these groups actually has controlled territory and has its own people to govern. So at least it wants to sound more inclusive and more moderate just to appeal to the more heterogeneous people. They have to relax their religious regulations so more people can meet their bar. And sometimes the groups even want legitimacy and recognition internationally. They want a seat at the table. They want to talk more like a government. So they would pitch itself at a more moderate and secular position. Some scholars also call this domestic effort rebel governance and call this international effort rebel diplomacy. And again, in this logic chain, the key is the target audience. It unifies groups' military power and their ideological appeals as reflected in propaganda within the same framework. So I highlighted in red. To just help you better think about my arguments graphically, I designed this parsimonious diagram. Again, just to repeat myself, weaker groups target core audience and therefore use more religious rhetoric. Stronger groups want to reach broader audience and therefore talk more secularly. From here, I'm going to derive some testable hypotheses for the empirical studies. First of all, I'm going to directly test the relationship between military power and ideological appeals. My theory predicts a negative association between the two. This is the most important association in my research. And then I'm going to test an immediate corollary following H1. So I said the choice of ideology is their strategic choice. So we should only see H1 holds in their public propaganda, but not in their private internal documents. And from there, I'm going to test the mechanism. And my theory predicts a positive association between military power and audience size, and a negative association between audience size and religious rhetoric. And finally, I'm going to test an observable implication, namely more moderate audience prefer more secular rhetoric. The first hypothesis and its corollary will be tested in study 1, and the second hypothesis will be tested in study 2. In this first study, I collected an original database of 87 jihadi magazines from 35 jihadi groups in the past 35 years. Magazines are the most prevalent propaganda channels for jihadi groups. A lot of these jihadi groups have magazines and they publish it regularly. And whenever a magazine issue came out, these groups just circulate these materials in all kinds of communication channels like WhatsApp and Twitter and Telegram. Ideally, I would want the population, the entire population of jihadi magazines. Practically, I collected every single issue of every magazine that has ever been identified by a trackable source. By trackable source, I mean research universities, research institutions, or independent organizations like Jihadology.net, or sometimes even the intelligence companies. In most of the cases, these sources would only identify the magazine names without actually providing the magazine. Remember, these materials are from these lethal terrorist groups. So I have to go back to search the materials. Usually I have to dig into the internet archive using the Wayback Machine. Sometimes I have to reach out to private sources. Sometimes I have to dig into the dark web. And eventually I was able to collect almost every single issue of every magazines that have ever been identified. I also used extensive internet search to find the covariates, including the group in charge, the language they use, the specific publishing date, whether the magazines target women in particular, etc. And here you see some examples of the magazines. These are the magazine covers. These are the inner pages. They are very well designed. And to extract text from these magazine pages, I use optical character recognition, or OCR. For each magazine page like this, OCR would identify the word chunks and recognize the word. I would specify the language, Arabic, for example, and then the machine will recognize the text and then return it in a format ready to analyze. I did this for more than 80,000 pages in my database. And from there, I translate all languages originally written in 12 languages to English. This is done by the Google Translation API. At the time of doing this research, translation is the most common way of doing text analysis in multi-languages. I also did extensive validation to make sure the loss of meaning in translation is only marginal. And from here, the task is to actually measure ideology from the text, to measure ideology in a secular versus religious spectrum. I use a text as data method called the dictionary. So the idea here is that I would want a dictionary with religious keywords and a dictionary with secular keywords. So later I can just scale the documents based on how many keywords it contains in each category. I developed my customized dictionary using a set of theory-driven questions. For example, what is the ideal social order? Well, religious order would emphasize governing the society using the divine power. So it would frequently refer to keywords like prophet, woman, Sharia. Well, on the other hand, a secular logic would talk about the secular government or the human power. So it would refers to keywords like citizenship, democracy, government, etc. I have other questions like how should individuals behave? Like why should people participate in jihad? Every question would add more keywords to these dictionaries. Importantly, I didn't just figure out these keywords off the top of my head, but instead I actually went through every single word in my corpus. So this is done after the translation. So even if Google Translation mess up and give many different synonyms of a word or different forms of a word, my dictionary would capture them out. I have more questions and be more than happy to talk about them in Q&A. So with the dictionary, it's quite intuitive to derive the actual measure to actually measure ideology. I define a religiosity score as the numbers between religious keywords and secular keywords. So here you see some example documents. I just count the number of keywords, find the difference, and that is religiosity score. Very transparent, very easy. And by the way, I put these documents there just for your understanding. As toy examples, in my actual analysis, the documents is much longer. It's the maximum pages. So in other words, I'm actually arranging these maximum pages along a secular versus religious spectrum. The unit of analysis is a maximum page. And the results I'm going to show you are also robust to other unit of analysis as well. So let's just quickly see some descriptive statistics here. In this plot, you will see the log odds of the keywords as they appear in the documents. The more a word is placed to left or right, the more exclusively it shows up in more secular documents versus more religious documents. So I know I'm throwing a lot of words at you, so let's just look at a random sample. The interpretation of this plot is in documents with a higher religiosity score, we're more likely to see keywords like caliphs, Mecca, worship, pray. Well, in documents with a lower religiosity score, we're more likely to see keywords like government, rights, freedom, citizenship. That's exactly what I wanted. And this religiosity score is my main dependent variable. The main explanatory variable is military power. And to be honest with you, it's not easy to measure military power for this research because I need really fine-grained data that vary within years. Existing documents usually measure military power with two proxies. One is battlefield performance, the other is territory. And in this first study, I used battlefield performance because they are available for all these many groups in my corpus. So I collected the raw data from two very well-known data sources, UCDP, GED, and GTD. And from there, I calculate three main variables. They reflect how many total attacks these groups initiate, how many deaths they cause, and how frequently they directly confront the state government. And very importantly, I measure these military powers 60 days before the propaganda. This time sequencing is quite important because my theory says the group strategically designed their propaganda according to their battlefield performance. So battlefield performance needs to precede propaganda. In my second analysis, I'm going to show you the results with territorial control, but here I just want to very briefly show you that for the groups I have both measures, they actually correlate each other pretty well. So they are both indicators of military power. Now let's see the results. I'm going to show you the results estimated from OIS models. And in all the models I'm going to show you, the dependent variable is always religiosity score or their ideology in the propaganda. The main explanatory variables are the military power indicators, and I specify separate regression models, and in all these models, several covariates are included, including whether a page is a front page, the longevity of the magazines, the target gender, and the number of competitors. I also include language fixed effects and year fixed effects. This dotted line indicates non-effects. Basically, it's just 0. And in the first model, we see this coefficient. The main explanatory variable is total violent events. And for now, group fixed effects are not included. So we're making both across group and within group comparisons. This bar represents 95. This bar represents the coefficients with 95% confidence interval, where the robust standard error is classed at the maximum issue level. And we see that the bar is entirely below 0, it's negative and significant. That means when a group is militarily stronger, it's less likely to talk religiously. So it's negatively correlated. So let's think about some specific groups. We would say Al-Qaeda in Arabian Peninsula generally talks more secularly than a weaker group like Ansar Islam. And we get the same patterns with total deaths and same patterns with state-based battles. So now let's include group fixed effects into the models. So we are making within group comparisons. And again, we see very similar patterns here with the negative and significant results. So here I'm saying that if we just take out one group and observe its changing rhetoric over time, Al-Qaeda in the past 20 years, for example, we will see that as the group gains power, it talks more secularly. And as the group loses power, it talks more religiously. And remember, the underlying logic behind this pattern is that the groups strategically tailor their rhetoric according to their military powers. They use their words to match their guns. Well, I further developed a placebo test to test that assumption. So if they intentionally do so, they shouldn't be able to design their rhetoric according to their military power in the future, right? So here I measure military power 60 days after the publication of the specific magazine issue. And we see the estimated coefficient is almost 0. So they cannot predict the future. We cannot use future predict past. So given these results and the results from the placebo test, I have more confidence in my theory. But I'm still not satisfied. Remember, I said these groups are strategic, and I kind of just get that assumption from existing literature. But what if they just somehow did it unintentionally? Maybe the groups just, when they're doing poorly on the battlefield, they just say, oh my God, oh Lord, please help. And they just refer to their religion unintentionally, and my religious messages happen to capture this rhetoric. Well, to rule out that alternative explanation, I further designed another placebo test with the group's leaked internal documents. Remember, the magazines are propaganda. They are what the group want you to see. And if they strategically design the rhetoric in their propaganda, then we should not see the same rhetorical pattern in the documents they wanted to hide from you, right? So that's why I further collected a set of leaked internal documents. These documents are internal in the sense that they were meant to be confidential. They were meant to be only read by the designated receivers, but they were unexpectedly captured by the US troops in the Middle East. And later, CIA declassified these materials, so I cannot analyze them. You see some examples here. There are just plain text without any layout designs. Again, they were not supposed to be seen by us. So now I'm going to compare the rhetoric in these internal documents to the rhetoric in the propaganda. A possible challenge for inference here is that these internal documents were not captured systematically. So just to make them as comparable to the magazine sample as possible, I use a technique called matching. I use exact matching for group names and nearest neighbor matching for time. So basically, I want to compare the internal documents and magazines published by the same group or released by the same group and around the same time. And I see if the rhetorical patterns are similar or not. Here I'm going to show you the results. Still very similar setup as previously. We have the dependent variable being the religiosity score, the ideology in the propaganda in the documents, and the main explanatory variable is military power. I run the regression with the two corpus separately, and here you see the results. With the maxing corpus, again, the results is negative and significant. So as the group gain power, it would talk more less religiously in the propaganda. Well, we do not see a similar rhetorical pattern in the internal documents because they don't want to design this. They just be themselves. And therefore, we see a differential rhetorical pattern here. And this provides me more confidence to my theory. Now I want to dig into the mechanism. If you still remember this diagram, the mechanism is on the audience. And just to repeat my theory, I predict that weaker groups would prioritize core members and stronger groups would appeal to broader audience. It's very hard to track the actual readers of magazines, so now I turn to social media. I leveraged 6 million ISIS tweets in 2015. You know that ISIS is arguably the most high-profile jihadi groups in the world. And an additional advantage of using their tweets is that they like the US intervention in Syria and Iraq in 2015 exogenously bring very large variance in ISIS military power. I identify a tweet as associated with ISIS if that user was reported by other users for supporting ISIS and later taken down by Twitter. So basically, Twitter would confirm that, that report. And there are about 20,000 users like that in my corpus. I structure my data as a user date panel so I can better account for the time dependencies, and results are robust to tweet level analysis as well. Some key variables, I still measure ideological appeals in this text using the dictionary methods I showed you previously. That's the religiosity score. And now I measure military power using territory data. This data is from an intelligence company, and this company collects highly local data every single day for ISIS across 2015. And they draw a map for ISIS every single day, very fine-grained data, and you can see there's some variance across time. I use Geographic Information System, GIS, to calculate the sizes of this territory, and that's one of the key variables in this analysis. And Twitter data also allows me to quantify the group's effort to reach a broader audience using these mention functions or add somebody. Existing literature has shown that Twitter mentions are a very good proxy for coordination in conflict settings. And here, I'm particularly interested in measuring ISIS attempts to coordinate outside of their existing network. Remember, I've already collected the ISIS user list, and I want to see when would they step out of their network and reach people outside of this network. Here I'm going to show you the results. In all the models, I'm going to show you the covariates are included, the lag-dependent variables is included to account for the time dependency. And in this first model, the main explanatory variable is military power measured by territory. The main dependent variable, is reaching broader audience. And this bar represents, again, 95% confidence interval with robust cluster standard error, and it is entirely above 0. That means as the group gains power and controls more territory, it is more likely to reach broader audience online. And now let's see what happens when the groups try to reach a broader audience. Now the main explanatory variable is reaching broader audience, and the dependent variable is religiosity score, their ideology in the tweets. And we see the effect is negative and significant. So that means when the groups try to reach out to a broader audience, it talks more secularly. So this effect is substantively large, and after standardized data, it's basically larger than almost all other covariates in the model, including these two Islamic holidays. I thought that's very impressive because we know for a fact that these two Islamic holidays affect religious rhetoric. So now I just want to prop this idea just a little bit further. Just now I show you that groups change their rhetoric according to different audiences. And they do so because I say the audience favors different rhetoric. Well, is that really the case? Now I want to show you some evidence from people who actually read these tweets. I want to ask, do core ISIS members indeed prefer more religious rhetoric? So now I need evidence from people reading these tweets. I define core members as members whose follower numbers are among the top 5%. So they are the influencers in the ISIS network. And the rest of 95% are the peripheral members. I leverage the retweet function to as a proxy for favoring the tweet. So the assumption here is that a user would only retweet a tweet if she or she finds the tweet is appealing or related. So here my dependent variable is the difference between core member retweet and peripheral member retweet. The main explanatory variable now is the rhetoric in the tweet, religiosity score in the text. I have other controls as well. So let's see the results together. We see this coefficient is positive and significant, meaning that tweets with higher religiosity score are more likely to be retweeted by ISIS core members. Indeed, ISIS core members favors more religious rhetoric. Okay, now I want to summarize what we have learned today. Today, I introduce a new weapon of the weak theory. This theory unifies groups' religious rhetoric and military power within the same framework. And I theorize that weaker groups are more likely to use religious rhetoric as an ideological weapon. And empirically, I present two big data quantitative analysis using data from jihadi groups. And with all these efforts, the goal of mine is to reintroduce ideology into IR security and conflict studies. Political science is a discipline that heavily emphasizes ideology. But when it comes to conflict studies, we tend to shy away from this idea because it's very hard to study. My ambition is to re-emphasize the scrutiny of ideology in our subfield, especially as we advance in quantitative analysis. And the project you saw today is just a part of my efforts to achieve that goal. In the past few years, I built a research agenda that centers on ideology and propaganda in violent movements. Besides religious extremists, I presented today, I study all kinds of violent and extremist movements across the globe, ranging from anarchist to far right. Especially with the recent book project, I try to put forward a macro level theory just to get the fundamental logic and the terrorist propaganda. I also have some other works on territory and borders. They are arguably the most important institutions in international relations, and I always tie these geographic factors to individual attitudes and support for conflicts. And finally, I have some methods work that helps scholars to better understand ideology, propaganda, and individual attitudes. Traditionally, when we think about international securities, we often think about conflict and violence. But what keeps driving people to commit violence are words and ideas. That is why I'm so obsessed with these ideas. I believe they are the key for conflict mobilization, and thus they are the key for conflict prevention. Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate your time.
you. Anyway, that was perfect. So I will keep a list of questions. Caitlin, your hand is up first. So first question to you. Everybody else, I will. So just keep your hands up. Yes.
Sure. Thank you so much for your talk. I've got two questions. One is about the independent variable and the way you're thinking about military power. If I'm understanding your story right, you're treating battlefield deaths as a measure of military strength. So more deaths means more military strength. And I guess it'd be helpful to understand what the thinking is there in all the other literature I'm familiar with, like military effectiveness literature. Higher battlefield deaths are considered a sign of military weakness and lack of military effectiveness. I can think of some mechanisms for you, but I'm curious what you think the mechanisms are and why it would be different in this context as an indicator than in all the other contexts. And then secondly, I'm trying to understand better the role of time in your argument. So it seems like you're basically assuming, or you're treating all of these instances of propaganda being issued as just independent observations, and these groups are very agile and they can just switch back and forth between more secular and more extreme appeals. And I guess empirically, like, why should we assume that that's how those ideologies actually work? I mean, isn't it the case that, I guess I would think of ideologies and kind of brands of these groups getting locked in fairly early and then maybe being quite difficult to change. And my impression there is reinforced by the fact that I look at some of the very most successful violent extremist organizations and what happens when they have success, like when ISIS takes over Raqqa and Mosul, do they moderate and suddenly switch to like more secular appeals because they clearly have military power now? The Al-Qaeda taking over Afghanistan, like same thing. They don't seem to be as fluid, at least in the well-known cases, as maybe your theory assumes. It seems like it gets locked in early, and maybe also like the beliefs are sincere, and so they're not changing as much as your sort of strategic theory seems to indicate. What did you say? Yeah. Well, yes. I don't want to speak out of school. It seems like they actually get more extreme, but again, I don't. So that's my question: is this the right way to think about time in your argument? Thank you.
Awesome. Should I respond
Yes.
right now?
Yes.
Awesome. Thanks for the question. So for the first, generally when we think about military strength, you're right that death is not only indicator, but so in this context, first, death is measured by how many deaths they actually caused from the other side. And second, the ultimate goal of jihadi groups is to build Islamic society using violence, like they specifically emphasize violence as a role to achieve that goal. So as long as they are not there, they haven't built a transnational caliphate, they would continue using violence, and they are very proud of it, and they emphasize that in their addressings and public discourses. And for the second question about their time, I think you're right that groups' brand, their overall brand is pretty much locked in. As I said earlier, these groups are called radical Islamic groups, or they call themselves jihadist groups, and that's not going to change. But what they can change is to change their rhetorical emphasis in their day-to-day propaganda. They can choose to emphasize their religious nature, and they can choose to preach more to their audience, or they can choose to talk more about their more secular economic governance aspect of their function. That's something that they can choose, and they can be flexible about.
Nilsa, did you have your hand up in the back?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay, over to you.
Well, thank you so much for this presentation. I'm confused about one thing, and I think in your presentation you're mentioning that if a group is more secular, they're able to give more material benefits, and that is like how they have a broader audience. I think I'm thinking of some of these groups that you're looking at, and a lot of these groups will provide material benefits to the people that are joining them. So, and I think a strand of civil war literature really speaks to the saying, yes, these people have grievances, but they also receive material benefits, right? So what I'm curious about is, do you actually have data on what is provided to the people joining these groups? Or how do you really assess whether someone gets material benefits or not, or what they receive?
Okay, awesome. So unfortunately, I don't have really fine-grained data across time for all of these groups, but anecdotally, material benefits, as you said, is very important components in this theory. So it differs from different audiences. For the core members, they care very little about material benefits. They care about the spiritual rewards, and that's why they become probably the only audience of these groups when they are weak and couldn't, when they can't provide material benefits. And for the more peripheral supporters, they pretty much care about both the spiritual rewards and material benefits to a different extent. So in reality, we have some anecdotal evidence that almost all these groups would actually give salary to their rank and file soldiers, and this like a couple like about a couple $100 per month, which is actually a lot of money given the context. So when a group is relatively strong, they can do that, and therefore they can emphasize secular rhetoric. Well, there are times when the groups cannot provide that, and therefore they would almost exclusively switch to spiritual rewards to get their core.
Rich Nielsen.
Wonderful to see this. I don't think I've ever had a more micro-targeted talk. So I have about a million things I want to talk about, and I'm going to restrain myself. So ideology. So your ending pitch was that like ideology matters for security studies. I'm on board. I'm going to go out on a limb and say not everyone in this room is equally convinced. So let me try out though how this sits uncomfortably for me with your argument at the beginning that they're not actually true believers in any sense and they're just strategic. So how does this theory work if the leaders are purely strategic and are just manipulating religious symbols? Does that mean the foot soldiers are not strategic in their understanding of religion? They're just like manipulable? Or that the leaders are true believers to begin with, but then get pragmatic over time? Like, is there like, hey, like I still believe that, you know, doing this the hudud way is the right way to do it, but, you know, we're cutting off too many hands in Raqqa, and so like we should probably stop talking about hudud as much in the magazines. That feels like it could match what you're saying about strategy, but I would still call that a true believer. Like their ideology is that they believe the hudud punishments are the thing to do, and they're just trying to figure out how to like grow a movement. Presumably that once those people are in the movement, they'll be like, yeah, and by the way, the thing you joined also cuts off people's hands when they steal, right? And where I feel like the data could be most informative is those internal documents. But as I understand it, you actually only showed us the difference between, you showed us that there's no effect, there's no change in the internal documents. But I was wondering about like the baseline religiosity of those internal documents. And then if it's not highly religious, like, could we subset by genre? Because obviously the propaganda is going to cite a lot of hadith and make a lot of references to like, we do things because of the prophet, but presumably not all communiques between jihadi leaders are going to like they're actually fairly pragmatic documents, like some strategy and such, right? I'm just trying to figure out how to square, like, who really believes in your story, and if the story is that the leaders don't really believe, then how are we coming back to actually like ideology is really a super important thing for security studies?
Yeah, so here's how I understand this. I think leaders are true believers. They're not true believers of Islam, though. They're true believers of their radical interpretation of Islam. So they do believe in this, and even though they change their rhetoric, they are not talking about something they do not believe in. They're just strategically emphasize what they think the audience want to say. So even though, for example, when they talk about the secular aspects about their movements, they for example, in the research from Islamic scholars like Oliver Rowe, they talk about how they bring up this ideology, this ideological concepts of economy that didn't exist in the traditional Islamic sense. like they are not talking about something they do not believe, but they just try to incorporate their beliefs into a secular world that could potentially sound appealing to a more heterogeneous audience. And then they always believe in their ideology, but they can choose their rhetorical emphasis. Well, on the other hand, for the rank and file soldiers, I honestly, I hate to say this, but in my readings, they are relatively easy to manipulate. And this is reflected in the documentaries and the documents I've read. Like they are pretty, they can be easily brainwashed, and you can easily see that they are contradictory ideas in their ideologies, but they kind of just live with it. And in my experience with talking to people in ISIS, they mentioned that a lot of these followers are actually very young. They are not well educated, and they can be easily convinced by these violent groups. And I also agree with what you just said about the internal documents. I remember I checked the baseline rhetoric. They are pretty much the same, but there are probably like more opportunities if we just subset it by genre and see like how they differ in that sense. Thank you.
Great. Okay. In the front, but I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
It's Spiridula.
Spiridula. Okay.
Yeah, it's Greek. Lovely presentation. I loved it. And I completely agree with the conclusion that we have to incorporate ideology to the strategic studies. I had the same question about the internal documents. How can we be sure? I mean, in the first place, we conclude that the internal documents lack this particular religious element because the specific keywords such as prophet and so on and so forth do not exist. And if so, how can we be sure that by being themselves, as you specifically mentioned, are not actually being super religious still, despite the lack of those keywords? That was my question.
Yeah, that's a nice question. So I have to clarify that in these internal documents, they actually have lots of religious keywords. And in fact, the baseline level of these religious rhetoric is pretty much similar to that in the documents. So I've seen they say, hey, brother, God's told us to do this and we have to continue our jihad. It's just they don't change as much as we see in the propaganda. So I interpret that as evidence that they do not strategically tailor their rhetoric in these private documents. Thank you.
Let's see, Maria Grimberg.
Thanks. Given your arguments, can you please tell us how weak groups can become strong?
Yes, absolutely. So in this group, in this analysis, the military power is the explanatory variable. It's relatively heterogeneous, and it's the initiating factor in this mechanism. So a lot of factors can affect group's military power, and many of them are beyond the group's control. So, for example, in the ISIS case, the U.S. intervention basically determines their military power. Like they, like when ISIS bombed, their military power just plummet, and over time they gain their military power because they just gradually develop it over time because they or maybe their opponents, like their enemies, they make a strategic mistake, or the opposite, their opponents become very strong and they might be weaker on the other hand, and they might get just a windfall of external resource, and then they build their military capacity in that way. That's also possible. The windfall could come from an external actor like a foreign government or some individuals from the local community. So many things can determine their military power.
So if you were to plot ISIS religiosity scores before the U.S. intervention, right, would it basically be increasing, flat, or decreasing?
before the U.S. intervention.
So basically, if the U.S. intervention is peak power,
Right.
I'm not sure if that's an actually true statement.
That
but,
is actually
but,
true.
Okay, it is an actually
But
true.
I guess I should let the speaker say
No.
that. A little close to the data. Sorry.
So like what just how does the religiosity score move around from like, I don't know, moment of creation, or at least moment when they had some viable sort of military capability, to like this moment of peak power?
Yeah, we don't have to imagine that. I actually plotted that out, so we can see. Yes, so you can see right before this. Actually, we didn't capture like the religiosity score when it's at peak, but you are pretty much correct that before the U.S. military intervention, it's at its peak, and even if the data actually the intervention starts from 2014, so I would expect the religiosity score being even higher, and then as the U.S. intervene, we see a gone down, and then there are some fluctuations across time. So you see a pretty clear negative association between the religiosity score and the military power as.
But aren't there casualties going up massively that entire time? Like, aren't the two measures pointing in different directions?
So this is not the casual. So this is measured by territory controlled by ISIS, and all the results you see here are also robust to the military power measure. And that measure, so if we measure that, that would be the death toll caused by ISIS during a particular window. That's not like ISIS own death.
Sorry,
Finger.
I'm double dipping, but which magazines is this specifically?
This is Twitter data.
Oh, this is the Twitter
Sorry,
data.
this is the Twitter data.
Oh, but okay, I'll see you at lunch. So
Yeah.
I truly have a million questions. Apologies.
To follow up quickly on this, but if ideology is a weapon of or religious extremist rhetoric is a weapon of the weak, why would it peak when they are strongest before the U.S. intervention?
Oh, well, because I would say U.S. I want to correct this a little bit. So U.S. intervention actually starts before this period, like
Okay.
right here. So, sorry, I should say, it didn't. It basically we see the exact opposite of military power and religious score. And when U.S. intervene, they hurt their military power, and that's why we see the religiosity score becomes really high.
Okay.
And later during the 2015, like it actually recovered from the middle of the year, and therefore we see the religiosity score went down during this time. Okay, sorry, I thought I probably conflated that idea a little bit because that's the case. The first intervention is before this period. Okay, thank you for correcting me.
Nilsa says a two finger on this point. Okay.
Yeah.
So wouldn't, for instance, having less territory also potentially lead to more deaths? Especially if we think about the terrorism murders groups, since many of these groups are underground, don't really hold territory, but can cause massive casualties because of the type of attacks that they're doing. So are those measures, because I understand those are cumulative, so but would they not be also opposite?
Yeah, so first I want to ask you, what kind of deaths are you talking about? Are you talking about the death caused by the group or the death toll of the group? Caused by the group. Is that what you're asking? Yes. So basically, as the group become militarily stronger and control more territory, they are more likely. They have more power to cause a death from the other side.
Who is that?
Is the other groups fighting in in Syria. So they are fighting against different groups, and at that point, the Assad government at that point. Sometimes also civilians. So if we look at the death toll caused by the other side, then it's an indicator of the group's strength or group's military power. But I think you were talking about how they correlate with the territory control, right? If they control more territory, then they are more powerful, and therefore they have more chance of causing deaths to people. They can easily kill civilians.
What I'm saying is if they don't have as much territorial control, that's
Yes.
also possible because of the type of attacks. For instance, a suicidal bombing.
Well,
So I think
They
maybe
still
the question
can,
is like, as the group weakens, do they adopt even more violent tactics to the population around them?
well, for ISIS, in this context, they pretty much they didn't really stop terrorist attacks targeting civilians, even when they are stronger, even when they can directly confront the government, they didn't stop their attacks on the civilians. And for a fact, we have many anecdotes that when they control the territory, they didn't really protect the civilians, they actually attacked them. So they actually attacked more civilians when they actually control the territory.
Great. Okay, Isle.
Hi, I have a question about sort of the data generating process for these magazines. The editors who are commissioning the articles or the authors who are writing the articles across all the magazines and all the years, are they following the same playbook? Like, are the topics and themes they're discussing the same, or is it the case that in certain months there's not a lot going on, so you have a lot of religious commentary, and then other months there's a lot of battlefield videos that you can put out and a lot of news you can report on what exactly is happening. And so you still have like the same ideology as you had the previous month, but you're just writing about totally different things.
Oh, absolutely. So I didn't get the chance to say this in the presentation. So I intentionally exclude all the magazines devoted to just battlefield report for the exact reason you just described. Because for these magazines, like they would simply have more things to talk when they fight more, and therefore this battlefield indicator would end up at both sides of the equation. So these are included. For these 87 magazines, they are devoted exclusively to ideological control purposes. And they're talking about like either preaching or their life or these general worldviews.
We've got two fingers, Eric Greenberg, and I think Pippin, although it's hard to see from. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for the talk. I guess my question follows on a also, comment about editorial choices. Do you see mirroring in content across different propaganda publications at the same time, right? We know that in many cases these violent groups are competing for the same supporters, right? And so if you are being strategic, and I'm the strategic editor, and I see my opponent's group attracting people because of their religious text, won't I mirror that regardless of whether or not I'm able to offer some other type of payoff?
So you're asking about groups' strategy regarding their competitors.
Right. So you see mirroring in the content of magazines that are targeting the same potential group of supporters.
Like some kind of outbidding process. Yeah.
Yes, there is an outbidding process going on, and I think that's part of my theory. So how it works is that when, let's imagine a weaker group, it might face a bunch of stronger counterparts that has more military power, and they can talk about the material goods, they can talk more secularly. And therefore, for that reason, the weaker group's surviving strategy would be move to the tail and try to get the really core groups.
But I guess what I'm saying is if I see my adversary is attracting large numbers of people using this highly religious text, can I just mirror that, right? There's this, you seem to have this implicit assumption about the preferences of the group that's being recruited, right? But what if the population just is being attracted to these hyper-religious texts?
It depends on your group power again. So if you are a stronger group and your opponent is very successful in getting the core members, but they get 10 members, you would want more than 10, right? So you would have an incentive to move to the ideological center, kind of like the medium bottom theory. And you would want to get more followers than your opponent does.
if you had three equally sized groups, hypothetically,
Yeah.
and one starts to adopt more extreme religious rhetoric, would the other groups try to match that by also adopting more extreme rhetoric to attract? They're all three groups are trying to attract the same people, right? Trying to recruit from the same population.
Yeah.
So if one starts becoming more, I think this is what you're asking.
Thank you for rephrasing the question.
So like if one does it, group A becomes much more extreme in their idea. Would you expect B and C, sort of holding military power equal, to do the same thing, or would you expect something else?
Yes. So thanks. In that hypothetical case, I think we're very likely to see the groups talking at the same level of religiosity, but I'm not sure if they are just trying to match their opponents, or they just do what they can given their military power. It's very likely that they are just doing what they can rather than just match whatever their opponents are doing. If they do this calculation independently, then we would observe the same. And if they match, we will observe the same as well.
So did you make your finger on this?
Yeah, sort of. Maybe this has been answered and I just missed it. I'm wondering sort of about the stability of the magazines as a propaganda vehicle over time, particularly over the last decade. I mean, the rise of WhatsApps and videos supplanting magazines as a propaganda. I just don't know, but it seems like, at least anecdotally, the prominence of these magazines of 1984 to whatever may have been sort of the propaganda channels, but are you confident in their stability over time as the primary propaganda vehicle? It's a valid indicator or measure of religiosity?
Yep. So
I don't know if that's what you're
yeah. So what's interesting about their propaganda strategy is that they see in Telegram channels. I try to follow them for quite a long time. Their strategy is that they have to quickly like dismiss a channel and then give a link and then move to another channel. They pretty much do that every other day just to evade all the censorship. So that means they do not directly post the language. That's exactly why they need the magazines. They actually circulate these magazines on these platforms. So when they switch channels, they actually post it there.
It's sort of a stable indicator over time.
Yes, I believe so. And also the video, like right now I'm conducting this much larger project that brings together all these other channels, including the video. So video is very important for groups like ISIS, but I would say the number is quite limited compared to the magazines. There's a lot of repetition in these different videos, and also it's only available for the high-profile groups like ISIS, but not the smaller groups. But magazines are pretty universally distributed.
I'm tempted to say something about TikTok, but I'll just get in trouble with my 14-year-old.
We are collecting that.
Alex Downs.
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm interloping today.
Welcome.
George Washington via Dartmouth. Glad I took the early bus down this morning. This was really interesting. A couple of annoying but hopefully helpful comments, and then a couple of short questions.
Yes, please.
One that's been touched on, first been touched on already, which is about the independent variable and how you measure it, military power. We call it battlefield performance, which I think is a bad idea, because you're not measuring battlefield performance. If you were measuring battlefield performance, you would look at something like loss exchange ratio, or other things you can read about in Cleveland's book or Jay Lyle's book. You're really trying to get at military power, so why not? I mean, territorial control gets at that. Number of attacks kind of gets at that. It's not as good, but then group size. I would recommend going along those lines. Second annoying but hopefully helpful comment is, I don't understand how this is new weapon of the week theory. It's just weapon of the week. Weapon of the week theory has been around for a long, long time. Terrorism's a weapon of the week. Groups that are losing, we can use more civilian violence. It's applied to a new area. I'm not sure that makes it new. I also wasn't sure, and this is my first question is maybe.
Yeah.
is, this came up just now. How is this different from just outbidding? You didn't talk about outbidding at all in your presentation, and of course, read the paper. But it just seemed like this is what's going on. Second question is also related to what's come up. You know, as a sort of partially informed outsider, I look at groups like Al Qaeda and the Islamic State, and I'm like, geez, they seem to be using a lot of religious appeals to attract transnational fighters, for example. And I was just looking at when James Foley was beheaded, which was 2014, which seemed to be, it's not just publishing magazines and so forth, but it seems like that's pretty full of religious connotations and statements. So I just kind of wonder, like, what groups are driving your finding? Is it, Al Qaeda, Islamic State, a bunch of tiny groups? Like, what's the distribution? What, we have 35, I think. Is that right? Just curious, like, who's driving these findings?
Yeah,
All right.
awesome. These
So you've
are
got a lot, but
Yes,
feel
these
free to
are
pick and choose what you
super,
want to
super
respond to.
helpful comments. I'll just briefly respond to all of them. So first of all, I agree that I should just call it military power, and this military power about like death they cause is pretty much the best I can get with all these many groups. I actually collected the data of group size, but first it's very, very sporadic, and also the quality is not great because the different sources would use different standards. But anecdotally, they match these military power measures in my paper. And then I would love to just call my theory weapon of the week. I don't know if Martha Crenshaw would agree with that, but if she does, then I would really love to do it. Outbidding, I do think competitors requires a different paper just for that. They are very important. It's just not the focus of the research, like the argument here, because I was very focused on the relationship between what happened on the battlefield or their military power and what they say, like their internal calculations. But I do agree that we need more theories to think about how they like deal with their competitors. And finally, for this paper, I use language fixed effects to control their change of rhetoric towards one relatively fixed audience. So whether it's in English or whether it's in the more local language. And I think what's fascinating is that even with the magazines that written in a foreign language, like in English, like they try to talk to international fighters, we still see this this ideological change or propaganda strategic change in their rhetoric. And even when, for example, Al Qaeda has this magazine called Inspire, even when Al Qaeda was really, really weak, they're still trying to talk to these core members overseas and say, please do not travel to the Middle East because we cannot provide you with the dorm room. We are literally weak. But if you can kill 1 or 2 Americans in your hometown, that would be a huge help. That's something they literally say in their magazines. So even in these towards their international audience, they are still core members, like overseas for them.
Peksha.
Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. My question is about your dictionary and your coding of religious perspective words. So how do you know a word is being used to endorse a position as opposed to critique it? So if there's a magazine article that is all about criticizing secular ideas and institutions, it's likely to have a lot of secular words. So how do you differentiate between what position that magazine is actually taking?
Yes, great question. So I just didn't have the time to actually get into this. So the question here is that sentiment analysis. Okay, so how do we know that they are not criticizing them, but actually embrace this ideology? So I measure the sentiment in these magazine pages, whether it's positive or negative. And what we see here is that when the groups become more powerful militarily, they also have more positive tones associated with this secular rhetoric. So they are not just criticizing, but they actually embrace this idea. Like at least they talk about it in a neutral way. They say we need to build an economy, we need a government. So when we examine sentiment and ideology at the same time, we will see that's not just criticizing them.
Lauren,
Okay,
and
so
you can do both or one or
yeah, it's the same, I
Okay.
would say. So my question is also about the religiosity score. I would like to know a little bit more about why you include the secular word. So I'm going to offer maybe a simplistic explanation for the figure that you had up earlier.
Yeah.
Right. So you get less high scores on your religiosity scale when there's greater control of territory. But it could be the case that we have exactly the same number of religious words in every instance. And actually, all that's happening is when you take new territory, you have an article about the government and administration of that territory. And a lot of the words that are on your secular scale are the kinds of words we would expect to see in articles where you have administrative problems to solve and you're talking about them. And I don't think that necessarily indicates that we're actually seeing a change in the content of the religious ideology. So is that actually what's driving it, or is what's driving your effects changes in talking about secular issues, and how much does that matter? And the sort of related concern here is another sort of potentially straightforward explanation for that figure. So I've looked at the use of ideological language in North Korea's English language publications, and it's basically filler. When there's no other news going on, you get some article about a cultural competition at some high school somewhere in a rural area, and then that gets dropped as soon as there's something more important to talk about. And so is that what's going on here? Are we seeing these ideological articles kind of fill in the gaps when the editors don't have other things to talk about, and that's why it's being correlated with military performance? When you have, maybe these more successful campaigns, you start to get rhetoric around those, and you don't have to fill in the gaps with these sort of personal stories that maybe tend to be more ideological. So I'm just wondering if you can say a little bit more about what the religious language actually is and why, and sort of where's the mechanism that comes out of that? What's driving these effects?
Yeah, absolutely. So the exact reason I measure the secularity keywords is because if I only look at the religious words, as you said, when they get stronger, they might just simply have more things to talk about. So they would just naturally the proportion of religious words would naturally be driven down. So that's why I explicitly measure secular words. And the example you just gave about an administration roles, I actually think that's part of the story here. So as I mentioned earlier, some of the stronger groups actually control a territory and they have its own people to govern. So they have to talk about the needs of these people. So how do we define administration roles? It's not about the paperwork, but it's about what people actually need. What do you need an economy? What do you need healthcare? What do you need education? And how do we navigate their jihad, with quotation mark, in actual real world? So that's why they move to a more secular end when they are militarily stronger. And then for the filler, so in my experience, they can just not talk if they don't have other things to talk about. So like they don't have a fixed page numbers of magazines. It's not a task that they have to meet. But groups all want propaganda. They always have things that they want people to know, and therefore they never lack of language. They just want to convince people.
Kelly, I lost track of where you.
No, I had it two, and then I had one. But like most of the questions have been asked and answered already. I guess I'll ask one kind of follow-on question. Have you done any sample analysis that looks at areas where there are more and fewer? I know you looked at different numbers of competitors, but we're thinking about the state as being one kind of opponent and other, to get the outbidding issue, other groups as a different kind of competitor. It seems like they're all smushed together, and this might matter. So question is, have you looked at variation across contexts where the main opponent is the regime versus there are lots of other opponents?
Yeah, thank you. So I would say in the current research, the best effort that I could get is to have this number of competitors, meaningful competitors at the local level as one of the control variables in the regression. So that is accounted for. And then
But all competitors are treating the government and other jihadists, are competitors just other?
just the other groups.
Okay, so
There's
when
no
you
government.
talked about opponents being the government, that's separate.
Yes, that's separate. So that the government's role is reflected in the main dependent variable. One is the most prominent one would be how to what extent they directly confront the government and actually fight the states. So that here is a strong indicator of their capacity because weaker groups just cannot fight directly against the government.
Depending on the kind of attack. Okay, great.
So let's see, I've got Kunal and Raymond left. So why don't you each ask your questions? And then so we'll group them, Luwei, then come back and you can
Awesome.
answer both of them. So Kunal and Raymond. Oh, and Christine, you had a question?
Yes.
Oh, you have to raise your hand higher. Only because our new arrangement creates a line of sight problems for the host. All right, well, you'll now have 3 questions. Kunal, Raymond, and Christine, please ask your questions.
Thank you. So you're talking about if you want to reach broader audience, the messaging should be secular. And if you want to reach narrower audience, the messaging would be religious in nature. So this, if I follow this argument to its conclusion, it's difficult to explain how can the Taliban control the whole of Afghanistan. Or at least the Taliban should moderate after it is controlling Afghanistan. And still women are not allowed in education. So how do you explain all that?
Great.
Yeah,
Raymond.
great.
I guess more of an empirical question. Like, do any of these groups in your data set actually end up having to govern? And is there a systematic difference between groups that end up having to govern and those that do not? Because governing is, I think of it as like an alternative explanation for moderate. Like, you just have to be more moderate if you might be a revolutionary group, but once you actually have to like provide basic services, your priorities change.
Great.
That's
And now Christine.
More about the group's incentive. I was coming in as an outsider. I was expecting the weaker group to have incentive to apply for like broader source of appeal because to compensate for their lack of military power, whereas stronger groups are in a more privileged position to care about the core or elite members. How do we think about that, which is different from your story?
Yes, absolutely. These are all great questions. First of all, I have a lot to say with the Taliban, and I hate that we are almost out of time. So actually, if you look at the Taliban's rhetoric right before it took power, you will see that it indeed, actually in my measure that point, it indeed switched to a more secular. And when they are, this is before they took over Afghanistan, but just about to took over Afghanistan, they indeed increased their secular rhetoric and directly addressed the issue of women education and even entertaining. This is in comparison to their previous rhetoric. If you remember, this is at the start of the COVID, they literally say God gave us COVID to punish us. So everything for them is about religiosity, whereas as they grow stronger, they no longer say that. So we see the change as expected. But I think the unfortunate news is that what they are saying is not necessarily what they were doing. And right now they are having like very harsh policies on women's rights. So that's something we need to be aware of, and it's the very unfortunate news. And then for the governing things, I would say for most of these groups, they are, I wouldn't call it as binary, but for them, there's a mix of governing versus not. So almost all groups have some sort of governing, even if even the weakest group, they provide schools, not necessarily like full-time schools, but they provide preaching services, and they have these doctors. If you feel headache, they do provide part of the services, even the weaker groups. But obviously, the stronger groups have much more capacity to do that. And then for the group's incentives, as I said, I think that's so when groups are relatively weak, they would really, maybe they want to reach to the broader audience, they want to be stronger, of course. But as I said earlier, that's not feasible for them. Like even if they say, I'm going to be your government of your all, but you will not really listen to me. You won't believe in me because I'm so weak. So in order to survive, they have to only concentrate on the course. And then for the stronger groups, like yes, they would benefit their core group in a lot of ways, maybe from private channels, but in their public propaganda, they have to position themselves more secularly, just to signal the people and to signal the world. And sometimes even that propaganda would annoy some of the core members. Again, in the Taliban case, we saw some actual discussions happen within the group when they are just about to take power and people say, are we losing our core identity? Like they actually have this conversation within the group. But to the outsiders, when they come to their propagandas, they still try to behave in a way that they are actually representing broader people.
Great. Well, that was a terrific talk. Thank you so much for sharing your research with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.